In the winter of 1981, council workers came for a house that was never supposed to reach old age. It was a small aluminum bungalow on the edge of a post-war estate outside Bristol. 2 bedrooms, 1 narrow hallway. A kitchen no bigger than a railway compartment. And inside it stood a 73-year-old woman named Edith Lawson, watching strangers label the things she had spent half her life refusing to leave. The roof had started taking water. The wiring had been marked unsafe. One wall panel had corroded so badly that daylight showed through near the floor. A younger man from the council tried to be kind. He told her the new flat had central heating, solid walls, a proper roof. Edith looked past him toward the kitchen sink, because that sink was where hot water had first come out of a tap for her. And that is the part people miss. The mystery is not why Britain's prefabs eventually failed. They were temporary houses. They were built in a country that had run out of time. Is why so many families stayed in them long after the government had stopped believing in them. Why they ignored the letters. Why they patched the leaks. Why they painted over corrosion. Why they turned a 10-year emergency shelter into a lifetime address. To understand that, you have to go back to Britain in 1945, when the war had ended but home had not returned with it. By the end of the bombing, roughly 200,000 British homes had been destroyed outright. Millions more were damaged badly enough to make ordinary family life impossible. London was not the only wound. Plymouth, Coventry, Hull, Southampton, Bristol, whole streets had been broken open. But rubble was only the visible problem. The people who would normally rebuild a country had spent years doing something else. Bricklayers had been soldiers. Carpenters had become engineers. Factories that once made door frames, pipes, baths, and roof tiles had spent the war making wings, tanks, shell casings, and aircraft parts. So when peace arrived, Britain did not simply need houses. It needed houses faster than its own building industry could produce them. And then the men came home. Between 1945 and 1947, around 5 million service members were demobilized. They came back carrying kit bags, ration books, nervous hope, and the same ordinary wish. A room of their own, a door they could shut, a kitchen where a family could begin again. The country had the greatest housing demand of the century at the exact moment when its housing stock was at its weakest. Traditional building could not close that gap quickly enough, so the government reached for the one system the war had perfected: mass production. If Britain could build aircraft in pieces, ship them across the country, and assemble them with terrifying efficiency, then perhaps it could build homes the same way. The idea was brutal in its simplicity. Use wartime factories. Stamp out standardized panels. Fit the wiring and plumbing before the house ever reached the estate. Load the parts onto lorries. Set them down on concrete foundations. Bolt a house together in days. Not months. Days. These were not meant to be charming. They were not meant to become heritage. They were officially temporary bungalows, built to give families 10 years of breathing room while permanent housing caught up. A trained crew could take one from empty foundation to ready occupancy in about 5 to 7 days. Entire estates appeared on bomb-cleared land. with a speed that must have felt almost unreal to people who had spent years waiting in crowded rooms. By the time the program slowed, Britain had produced more than 150,000 prefabricated homes, and the instruction was clear from the beginning. Use them for a decade, then remove them. But the first families who stepped inside those metal houses did not experience them as a footnote. They experienced them as a door opening. Many had come from emergency billets, shared bedrooms, relatives' parlors, church halls, or rooms so overcrowded that sleep had to be negotiated. They expected something cold and mean, a metal hut, a state-issued compromise. Instead, they found fitted kitchens, not a loose table shoved against a damp wall, not a washstand, not a gas ring balanced beside the coal bucket. A planned kitchen with cupboards, worktops, a cooker, and a sink that belonged exactly where it was. For thousands of working-class women, it was the first kitchen that had ever been designed around their labor instead of simply absorbing it. Then came the bathroom. A full bath, hot running water, an indoor toilet. Those words sound ordinary now. In the mid-1940s, for many of the families moving in, they were almost unbelievable. Some had bathed children in tin tubs in front of the range. Some had used shared wash houses. Some had gone outside in the dark to a privy used by more than one household. And now a temporary aluminum bungalow offered them private plumbing their old permanent homes had never had. That contradiction is the heart of the story. The state called them temporary because of the materials. The families called them home because of what those materials gave them. The prefabs were not perfect. They were never close to perfect. In winter, the walls seemed to pull warmth out of the room. Families learned where the drafts came through before they learned the names of every neighbor. Frost formed on bedroom windows. Blankets grew damp. Mothers put coats over sleeping children when the coal ran low. The rain could be so loud on the metal roof that conversations stopped underneath it. Former residents remembered storms as a kind of assault, a hammering overhead that made the house feel less built than occupied by weather. And in summer, the same panels that froze them in January held heat until bedrooms became close and airless. The walls talked, too. At night, aluminum shifted with the temperature. It popped, creaked, clicked, and settled. Children grew up recognizing the sounds of their own house the way other children recognized stairs. There was little privacy. Thin walls carried arguments. Thin fences carried opinions. If someone boiled cabbage, half the row knew it. If a baby cried, 3 kitchens heard it. But hardship was not the same as failure, because the estate did something the planners had not put in the drawings. It made people necessary to each other. The families who arrived in those first years had come out of the same national fracture. Bombing, separation, rationing, widowhood, uncertainty, years of making do. And then suddenly, they were placed in rows of identical houses with identical gardens and identical beginnings. No one had much, which meant no one could pretend very convincingly. Women watched one another's children from the doorsteps while washing hung between the bungalows. Men repaired fences on Saturdays with salvaged timber and borrowed tools. Neighbors shared coal, onions, milk coupons, headache powders, prams, and news. A missing husband was not a private tragedy on those estates. It was known. A sick child was known. A late rent notice was known. A new baby was known before the washing line proved it. Children ran through the estate like it was one large, irregular house. They learned which kitchen offered bread and dripping, which garden had gooseberries, which old man shouted but never meant it, and which auntie was not really an auntie at all. That intimacy could be suffocating. People argued over noise, drains, dogs, fence lines, and whose child had broken whose window. But even the arguments proved something. They were not living beside strangers. They were living inside a web. And by the time the government began preparing to remove the prefabs, that web had hardened into something the official plan had never priced. Attachment, not sentiment, not nostalgia in the soft postcard sense. Attachment built from emergency, convenience, mutual need, and thousands of repeated ordinary days. The 10-year promise began to collapse almost as soon as the 10 years passed. Permanent housing did not arrive fast enough. Money remained tight. Materials remained short. Local councils had too many families and not enough brick houses to offer them. And the prefabs, despite their flaws, refused to disappear on schedule. They could rot. They could corrode. They could leak. But many could also be maintained. Residents patched them, painted them, insulated corners, fought damp, repaired gutters, grew gardens, added sheds, built fences, and made each plot look less like a government solution and more like a claim. That garden mattered. A prefab garden was not decorative to families still living under rationing's shadow. It was potatoes, beans, cabbages, a line of washing, a child's first steps, a husband's weekend work, a wife's proof that the ground around the house had accepted her. By the late 1950s, councils were sending letters to families whose temporary homes had already outlived their official purpose. The letters were polite. They offered rehousing. Often they offered something technically better, more solid construction, more space, a permanent address. On paper, it looked like an upgrade. At the kitchen table, it looked more complicated. Because accepting meant leaving the woman who had watched your children during a hospital stay. It meant leaving the man 2 doors down who fixed the pram wheel after your husband died. It meant leaving a garden grown out of bomb site mud. It meant moving from a place where everyone knew what had happened to you into a place where your history had to be explained from the beginning. And so families did something that confused officials. They refused, not once, again and again. Some ignored the first letter. Some answered and said no. Some accepted a viewing, came home, and decided the brick walls were not worth the loss. Some were offered transfers 3 or 4 times before the council stopped trying for a while. By 1960, around 80,000 prefabs were still occupied across Britain. By 1970, roughly 40,000 remained. Houses built for 10 years had crossed into their 3rd decade. Some would cross into a 4th. A few would survive long enough to be photographed in color by people who had never known the war at all. And this is where Edith Lawson's story returns. She moved into her prefab as a young mother when Britain was still counting bomb sites and ration coupons. Her children learned to walk between aluminum walls. Her husband laid the garden path with broken brick he brought home in a barrow. After he died, the neighbors did not let her disappear into the house. One brought coal. One checked the roof after storms. One sat with her on the evening the doctor left. So when the letters came, Edith folded them and placed them in a drawer. The first one said the bungalow was temporary. The second one said the council could offer better accommodation. The third one mentioned deterioration. She stayed. Year after year, the house took on the marks of a life longer than its design. The kitchen cupboard hinge was replaced with the wrong brass one. The bedroom ceiling had a stain shaped like a map. The garden gate leaned toward the pavement. A rose climbed the fence and scratched the aluminum wall whenever the wind came from the west. None of that belonged in the government's language. The council saw a unit, a structure, a maintenance liability. Edith saw 36 Christmas mornings, 2 funerals, 3 grandchildren, and the sink where hot water had once felt like a miracle. The darkest part of the story is that both sides were right. The council was not inventing the danger. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, many prefabs really were reaching the edge of what patching could solve. Corrosion could become structural. Flat roofs could fail. Old electrical systems could become hazardous. Insulation standards had changed. Fire risk mattered. Damp mattered. Age mattered. The houses had done more than anyone asked of them. But that did not make leaving them feel like progress. On Edith's last morning in the bungalow, the removal men began with the front room. Armchairs, a radio, 2 framed photographs, a biscuit tin filled with papers, curtains that smelled faintly of coal smoke no matter how many times they had been washed, then the kitchen. She stopped them there. Not dramatically, not angrily. She just asked for a minute. The men waited in the hallway while she stood at the sink. By then the enamel was chipped. The tap washer squealed. The cupboard below it smelled of damp. But more than 30 years earlier, that same sink had given her hot water without a kettle, without a tin bath, without anyone else's permission. That was the trick of the prefabs. They were cheap, fast, imperfect, and temporary. They were also the first modern homes many residents had ever known. They gave working people bathrooms before some permanent houses did. They gave bombed-out families privacy before the country could give them certainty. They gave neighbors a shared beginning strong enough to outlast the material meant to hold it. After Edith left, the demolition took less than a day. That was another cruelty of them. A prefab could take days to assemble and hours to erase. The panels came down. The fittings were stripped. The aluminum went for scrap. The garden was flattened. The path her husband had laid disappeared beneath machinery. In many places, brick houses rose where the prefabs had stood. They were stronger, warmer, more permanent. And yet former residents who came back years later often described the same strange absence. The new streets were better housing, but they were not the same world. The thing built between the bungalows had not been made of aluminum, so it could not be transferred when the aluminum was removed. A few prefabs were saved. Some became museum pieces. Some remained private homes. Visitors walked through the tiny rooms and tried to understand why anyone would fight to keep such a cold, noisy little building. They looked at the fitted kitchen. the narrow hall, the modest bedrooms, the small square bathroom. And if they looked carefully, they could see the answer. Not in the metal, in the scale. These houses were small enough that every improvement mattered, fragile enough that every repair became personal, plain enough that the people inside supplied the dignity themselves. Britain built them because it needed time. Families stayed because inside those borrowed years they built lives. The plan was temporary. The lives were not.